Good evening, and welcome to the pilot episode of Coach's Corner. I had planned on doing a different topic today, but given the recent situation in the country, I think that the best topic to talk about for today is actually the Colin Kaepernick situation, and specifically in regards to racism and policing and things of that nature. So, if you'll excuse me, I do have a pile of notes here that I'll be referring to. I have things cited, so I want to get things correct as I talk about them. So, the first thing that I would like to talk about is the FBI statistics. You know, we have to look at some sort of numbers to be able to analyze what's going on, whether it's a problem or not a problem, things of that nature. So it's easy enough for those of you watching. You simply go to FBI.com. The Department of Justice has the same statistics, but you can just simply Google murder by race and or ethnicity and find the statistical charts that you're looking for. It's not particularly difficult. Anybody that needs help, I'll be glad to find links for you. So what I'd like to start with on the FBI statistics for murder is, without the variable of occupation involved in the statistics, what you can find is that intraracial murder is actually far more common than interracial murder. And what I mean by that is simply that black people tend to kill black people far more frequently, and white people tend to kill white people far more frequently, Hispanics, so on. Interestingly enough, Asians have significantly lower percentages of murder within their own race than any other race that I've found. So I think that there is certainly a cultural aspect to this phenomenon. But to give you the statistics, which again you can find for yourself, for black people it's 89%. If most recent statistics, if you're black and you've been murdered, then it's 89% chance that it was another black person. For whites, that number is 86%, and for Hispanics, that number is 84%. And if I remember correctly, when you find the Asian statistic, it's actually in the high 50s, which to me definitely signifies a cultural phenomenon within this particular topic. But that's not really the issue here. As the country is divided over this particular issue, the issue becomes more specified to cops killing unarmed black people. If I'm not mistaken, if I am, somebody feel free to correct me. But I think that that's what the core issue is that people have a problem with, that the anthem protests, things of that nature are occurring from. So, we need to focus on whether or not cops killing unarmed black people is in fact an epidemic or something that should spark widespread protests and things of that nature. So, what I would suggest for those of you listening, the Washington Post has an article from a year ago. Google Washington Post fatal force, and on that site, when you open it up, it actually has a link to 3 different charts, if I remember correctly, that highlights the number of police killings of citizens, and it does break those down by race if you're curious, and it uses the Department of Justice charts to do so. If I'm not mistaken, they actually keep a running tab of this. So for last year, 16 unarmed black people were killed by the cops. In the year prior to that, it was 36. Now, those statistics do not take into consideration what the race of the police officer that killed them was. So of those 16 and 36 respectively, they could have been white officers, they could have been black officers, they could have been Hispanic officers. I'm sure that somebody can easily find that information for each case if they were to do enough digging. I guarantee it would take a while, but I'm sure it's out there. So in order to analyze whether or not it's an epidemic, and when we talk about epidemic, what we mean is a widespread phenomenon. That word matters a great deal when we use the term epidemic. Widespread. And that's where I think some of the people opposed to the anthem protests, I think that's where the issue falls. I'm sure that there are other reasons, but let's just look at this. I always hate when people use the analogy of lightning strikes to describe terrorism, specifically in our country, Islamic terrorism, and you try and equate a statistical significance to acts of terrorism to a lightning strike, and the argument goes, well, you're more likely to be killed by lightning. Yeah, okay, those things are not morally equivalent statistically, okay? Lightning doesn't choose to strike someone versus someone actually does choose to murder someone. So when I talk about this particular statistic in comparison, all I'm doing is comparing the statistics. I'm not trying to provide a moral equivalency of a lightning strike to a murder, okay? But if you do compare it to the statistics of a lightning strike, in a population of about 20 million, a little over 20 million of black people, 16 or 36 out of 20 million would be a statistical similarity to lightning strikes within the country regardless of race, which is approximately 300 people per year out of a nation of 320 plus million people. Okay, so it's not actually a widespread thing, even if it is a terrible thing when it happens, certainly if it's not a justifiable shooting. Okay, and we're going to get into that. So, then the next thing that I'd like to talk about is the situations that create the incidents that lead to police interaction with any given community. It doesn't have to be the black community, it could be the Hispanic community, the white community thing, you know, stuff like that. And that's quite simply the number of laws that we have. Take a look at, I don't know how old anybody is that's watching this, but let's say just for my age, I was born in 1983, look at the number of laws for nonviolent crimes that our country has added in the course of my lifetime. Hundreds of thousands of pages. Every law that we write, if it has any significance at all other than being a symbolic action, we're going to write this down because we think it's bad and we shouldn't do this. If it's to be enforced and we write this down, it will be a police officer of some sort going to do that enforcement. Alright? And that's what the nature of government really is. We're talking about a legalized monopoly on the use of physical force. We write a law down, we want it enforced. A policeman with a gun will show up and direct you accordingly to whatever, against whatever law, apprehend you, give you a citation, pull you over for a traffic stop. If you resist, they're going to offer suggestions, options for you to succumb to. That's not the right word. Excuse me, first attempt. So, the point being, the more things that we add for the police to do, to enforce, the more instances we are going to create for those interactions to occur. We're going to bring police and citizen together more often every time we write down a new law. Okay, one that comes to the forefront of my mind, we're talking about specifically about violence against black people, unarmed black people, would be the case of Eric Gardner in New York. And several years ago in the state of New York, I don't know if it's Governor Cuomo or Governor or Mayor Bloomberg previously that implemented the law, but the practice of selling what's called loosies, which is simply a single cigarette for $1. That's what Mr. Gardner was stopped for on the street. He was selling loosies, $1 cigarette. Here you go. Financial exchange. Okay, you give me a cigarette, I give you $1. Simple enough. Okay. If he had simply given the gentleman a cigarette, there is no crime against that. There is no law against that. So, him taking the $1, is what caused our police to interact with him in the first place. Don't get me wrong, I've watched this video. I saw what happened. 6, 7 police officers take down this man. I'm not sure that the homicide was intentional, but it happened. They took him down and one grabbed him by the throat. You know, he loses breath, he suffocates, and he's dead because of the fact that we asked them to intervene in a situation that was a transaction of $1 for a cigarette. Okay, that's the kind of incident that I'm referring to every time that we write a law down. If you want it enforced, there's going to be a physical end to the apprehension. If the person involved, Mr. Gardner, didn't want to stop selling loosies, how do you get a person to stop doing something that you've made illegal? If they don't want to stop, you're going to have to use physical force to stop them, whether it be to subdue them, to put them in cuffs, to chase them down, or if they're threatening violence or pointing a gun or wielding a knife or something like that, it will be obviously a fatal force application from the law enforcement. Okay. So, what I would move to then is, in order to reduce the number of instances where we ask the police to intervene in any given situation within society, you have to reduce the number of things we ask them to intervene in. You have to reduce the number of laws. Those laws are going to be enforced by interaction with police. Okay, that's what brings about the multiplication factor of instances where we ask the police to be involved. Okay. So then we talk about whether or not something is systemic, and that's a phrase that's commonly used on the people on the social justice side of the aisle and on these kinds of things, is that we in this country we have systematic racism. And systematic, you look the definition up, and what we're talking about there is a fixed plan. Okay, this is something that's an organized, fixed, applicable to all in society. Law, policy, structure of any kind. Okay? This is where I think that a lot of people on the social justice side of the aisle are going to disagree with me vehemently, and that's fine. I'm simply pointing out the instances where I see that we do have systematic racism. And unfortunately, on the other side of the aisle, these things, in my mind, are things that are actively promoted and supported by the people making this argument for social justice. Okay? Public education comes to the forefront of my mind. Okay, I'm not saying that public education is necessarily a bad thing, but when you have public dollars going to an area code and their teachers and their structures, their physical structures, the roads, the schools, the buses, things of that nature, as opposed to following the families, then what you do is the state gets to ask those families to stay in their zip code. That means if you're urban Detroit household, you're going to an urban all black or mostly black school. And if you're a suburban Michigan resident, you're probably not going to a highly mixed race school. That's the kind of instance that I'm talking about. And you can look across the country, and this is a phenomenon that is systematic. Regardless of which states you go in, the more urban areas that tend to be higher minority percentages within those schools have significantly lower positive educational outcomes. It's hard to attract teachers to those areas. For one, it can be difficult to get more vocational programs and things of that nature into those areas. Literacy rates in Detroit, the last I checked, 47% of adults in Detroit are illiterate. And there's been millions and millions of dollars thrown at literacy in Detroit specifically. So to me, it's not an issue of just sending money to a physical location and hoping for better outcomes for minorities in the country. If we were to give those dollars, those tax dollars, to the families of the poor, impoverished communities that are mostly minority around the country, they can choose to get out of those places for their educational opportunities. That's what I mean about systematic negative racial outcomes in relation to public education. If we trap a kid and their family in a certain zip code that doesn't have qualified teachers or better facilities, things of that nature, we're setting them up to remain in failing situations. I look at somebody like Ben Carson and think it's a miracle that he got out of the situation he did and became as successful as he did. Okay. The second thing that I would point out, and it's not something that people tend to think about, is Social Security, which is systematic. It applies to everyone. Let's think about it this way. The average life expectancy of a white person or a Hispanic person, or certainly Asian people, is significantly higher than that of black people for various number of factors, mostly heart disease. Heart disease is very prevalent in the black community. So what that means is, if you have an age where you receive Social Security benefits at 65, and the average black person only lives to be 67. Well, that Asian woman across the street, whose average life expectancy is 79 or 80 years old, she was receiving 13, 14, 15 more years worth of benefits from a systematic system. Is that a detrimental effect on African Americans that only get to receive 2 years worth on average of those Social Security benefits? That's what I'm talking about with systematic racism. It's a phenomenon that's applied differently by the state to different races, even though it doesn't intend to be. It certainly doesn't intend to be. I don't think that that's the case, but it has that effect, absolutely. The other one that I would look at would be medical malpractice. That's one that people almost never talk about as far as a systematic series of outcomes against certain people. According to Johns Hopkins University, johnshopkins.org, you can go on and find that it's about 250,000 medical malpractices per year in this country, regardless of race. And I didn't look up the racial statistics in those medical malpractices, but if you simply extrapolate the statistics based on the population and do a ratio comparison, about 7% of the population in the U.S. is black. And what that means out of the 250,000 is 17,500 black people being killed by medical malpractice on a yearly basis. None of those people are armed. That's kind of what I mean there. I'm not saying that that's an intentional thing either. It's just a widely applicable systematic effect that has negative outcomes on black people that are unarmed. All right, and that's obviously 17,500 is a far greater number than 16 or 36, which are at the hands of a police officer. And again, I don't know the statistics as far as whether those doctors operating are white, black, Asian, Hispanic, or anything else. Okay. Then the one that actually bothers me a great deal is abortion. For the life of me, I cannot understand why people openly promote, the same people on the same ideological spectrum as those on the social justice side of the aisle are vehement supporters of abortion rights, women's rights, as it's commonly phrased. I'll have another vlog for that particular topic, but let's just say this. Abortion in this country, and perhaps around the world, but certainly in this country, is founded on the idea that we should eliminate certain populations. I'm going to cite some quotes from the people that are the names synonymous with promoting abortion in just a second. But how many